Bienvenue au Canada. Welcome to Canada. To give you a geographic perspective here momentarily, I do want to recognize my colleague Jody Kositsky and another Rob Andrewlitis who contributed to this. I thought I would start out with a little bit of geography. This is the northern part of Canada. Now this slide is actually labeled the Circumpolar North, northern Canada. I actually don't know what that means. There's the Great Circle in the polar region, and then we have another region that's the subarctic. We have three, not provinces, but territories. Constitutionally, the government is a little bit different in the territories, but we have three territories in the north, which I'll show you momentarily, but the circumpolar region actually comes down a bit further. And I think the main point here by this term circumpolar northern Canada is that while we have a political boundary that defines our northern territories, in fact, many of the provinces in the south have remote regions that are also up in the north. And if you, there's not a pointer here, but, I'll get to it later. A really good question Lucy asked was, do you know what percent of your population is in, I think you used the term rural areas. And so I didn't raise my hand because I actually didn't know that. But you can see on the slide, the population in the three northern territories is 114,000. So that's 0.3% of the Canadian population. And this area I can't point to, which is on the east side of Hudson's Bay. We have a province called Nunavut, which is north of Hudson Bay. This is called Nunavut, which is part of the province of Quebec, and that has an even smaller population here. This next slide has all of Canada, and what I'm trying to show here are the rail access. And so you can see there's three provinces at the top, Yukon on the left, the Northwest Territories in Nunavut, and you can see that we have almost no rail access into the north. There's a little bit coming out of a province called Alberta into the Northwest Territories. At the very far west, if you look real close, there's actually a passenger rail line, but it's only for tourism and it's only seasonal. Years ago, it actually carried resources. That railroad was built for the gold rush 120 years ago. The gold ran out. And then in the far east, we've got a rail line. It doesn't get into the territories, but it does get into Labrador and Nunavut, which is an iron ore carrier. But you can see that rail transportation is to a large extent irrelevant. The deputy minister actually made reference to a rail line that was washed out a few years ago, and that's the rail line coming out of the center up to Hudson's Bay. And that rail line washed out. There's some debate, but global warming probably played a factor in this, and there's a lot of worry about global warming and what it's going to do to the permafrost on which a lot of the rail and very few highways are built. And the washout was so expensive to correct that the rail operator basically walked away from the railway. And the communities up there that were dependent on this line for over a year were dependent on air transport to get everything into the, almost everything into the communities, a little bit of a shipping season in the summer. This just highlights the railways that are up in the north, and you can see they're very limited. This cartoon then shows air connectivity, and on the left we have January, and on the right we've got July. They're almost the same in the two seasons, except we do have during the summer a program of charter flights that come into the Yukon for tourism purposes. These routes are often very small. The service would not even be daily on many of them. Most of the runways are gravel runways. And a challenge we have is the workhorse aircraft to move people and cargo is, I'm an old guy, so I actually remember this aircraft. It's a Boeing 737-200, and it's one of the few gravel-equipped aircraft. There's no Airbus A320s that are gravel capable, and the subsequent generations of the 737 are not gravel capable. And this is a problem because as the few 737-200s get phased out, many of these communities, the air service is going to be problematic because there's no obvious replacement aircraft for them. This diagram tries to combine all of the transport into one map. It's probably easier to see this in the paper there than it is on the slide. The north of Canada is heavily dependent on air transport for access. Well, there seems to be a lot of water there. It's often ice, although with global warming it's becoming less ice, but not particularly navigable, at least at this point in time. Almost no roads. There are, as the Deputy Minister said, we do have ice roads that operate only in the winter. We actually have a wonderful television series called Ice Road Trucking. It's a reality TV show about trucking along ice roads and the terror that these drivers have to live with. But they're very important. And as the Deputy Minister said, the season for this is declining. I've got a series of slides for each of the Northern Territories, and I'm going to leave that to you to peruse in the paper. This one of the Northwest Territories is interesting because it does, in the dotted lines, almost all the lines are dotted here, indicate the ice roads that are important there. So this is the Northwest Territories, which is one of the two diamond mining provinces. They're not blood diamonds, they're socially responsible. And then this is Nunavut. Air transportation is vital, as I indicated. This shows the growth in air transport in each of the three Northern Territories since 1981. I like to start then because that's roughly when I immigrated to Canada. And so you can see that we actually went a period of time with almost no growth, and then it took off. I'm going to make this point momentarily, but actually I'm going to just move to the next slide where I can make this, but before I do, there's a box here that makes an important point. There's no meaningful air cargo data for Northern services available to us. There are some numbers for two of the territories, but those numbers actually aren't correct. Canada's got a weird thing about not reporting charter air cargo, and a lot of the air cargo in Canada, especially for couriers, is by charter. So the cargo data just isn't meaningful here. Here I point out two pieces of legislation. The first piece is the Canada Transportation Act. This legislation, the earliest predecessor of this was 1967, and something that's important in the early history of Canada is a lot of our transportation policy was attempting to achieve regional equalization. And when the first, when deregulation took place in 1987, that act actually separated Canada into a northern region and a southern region. And just to tie into one of Lucy's points, in the northern region, we actually had a regime that the words she has in her last row talks about monopoly or restricted competition on certain routes or areas. And it was sort of like that, although it wasn't quite that strict. But there was a different regime in the north that gave some protection to incumbent carriers while the south was deregulated. But then within 10 years, that distinction in 1996 was then removed. So the air transport economic regulation regime in Canada applies in the northern remote regions as well as in the southern region. There's no distinction. But we do have one provision in our Air Navigation Services Act. Transport Canada used to operate, well, kind of everything. The airports, they own the airline, the railway, one of the railways. And Transport Canada actually ran the air traffic control system. But in 1995, that was transferred to a not-for-profit organization created by Parliament called NAV Canada. In the U.S., Bob Poole and others are strong advocates for a NAV USA to be developed, but Congress thus far has not seen it that way. In the Act, it actually says, and I highlighted this passage, charges for designated northern or remote services must not be higher than charges elsewhere in Canada. So even if the cost of maintaining facilities in the remote north are higher, the charges for en route and terminal operations are the same in the north and the south. Of course, NAV Canada has moved to satellite-based air navigation, so the really high costs we used to have for a lot of ground-based radar and control systems, technology has kind of made that point moot. I think that's an important point. We had a few years ago, once roughly every 10, 12 years, we do a major review of most of our pieces of legislation in Canada. So the most recent Canada Transportation Act review had some statements here. For those of you might recognize this as the Emerson Report. The Honorable David Emerson chaired this. And the report had a very small section about northern and remote services, but some of the statements were important. So again, I've highlighted here some key passages. The Act review observed, in many northern and remote parts of the country, providing mobility, connectivity, and vital goods and services poses serious challenges and are all barriers to market-based transportation solutions. So highlighting that the market may be challenged to work in remote regions. Support for a strong federal role in ensuring that northern and remote areas are connected to the national transportation system, however, indicate that Canada is a laggard in relation to other countries. So he's basically challenging the government to make further steps in improving what were the words again, Ophelia? It wasn't just connectivity, but, sorry? Accessibility. So I think that's something that they were trying to get here. Now, the statement continued, established transportation operators are sophisticated, adaptable, and well accustomed to doing business in the North. And this is very important. I think it's a contrast to some extent between Canada and the United States. Canada has chosen not to subsidize specific service to specific air carriers. Instead, the market will deal with air carriers. And I can generalize this as well. The market, the government does not subsidize rail carriers in the north, the little bit that's there. It does not subsidize trucking operators. Access to essential goods and services in many communities is only possible by air transport. And we'll get to that. Jody will actually make a comment about a particularly important set of goods, which are food, nutrition. So we do have a nutrition subsidy program. Responsibly unlocking northern potential is important. Transportation holds the key. And elsewhere in the report, he makes the point about to develop the potential of the North, which is very resource-rich and cultural-rich, has important tourism opportunities, but transportation is the key. Now, the next slide is, I want to point out a really important core policy in Canada, and we did not bring this out strongly enough in the current draft of the paper, and we'll rectify that. And that is that since roughly the early 1980s in Canada, the policy shifted to being one of user pay. Historically, Canada provided subsidies to transportation operators. Let me rephrase that. Historically, Canada provided massive subsidies to transportation operators. And so one of the areas is we locked in legislation the rate that farmers would pay to ship grain to ports for export. We locked that in 1903 at the rate, they went backwards to the 1898 rate. And that rate, which was in round numbers about 2 cents a ton mile, sorry, at the time they were miles, not kilometers. So I don't know, 1.5 cents a ton kilometer. But that rate was locked in until 1984. And so the rail carriers were essentially approaching bankruptcy because they're moving this grain by legislation at uncompensatory rates. And that all changed in the early 1980s. Canada had been subsidizing ports, airports. They never really subsidized the airlines except the one national airline, and the same with the railway, except they kept restructuring the finances of it, and some would say that was effectively a subsidy. But user pay became the policy, and so Canada followed the United States into deregulation. The United States didn't have to deal with privatization since all the airlines and railways were, trucking companies were already privately owned, but we privatized our carriers, which included the airline Air Canada. We had other private airlines, but Air Canada was the largest by a factor of 3. We privatized the railway. We privatized some northern marine resupply, and then the airports and the ports. And essentially, most subsidies were eliminated. There is some subsidy in a few areas like passenger rail services. And fees and charges were revised to recover costs. Canada does not subsidize carriers and provides little support to ports and airports. And so we talked about this actually at a previous OECD roundtable. There's no equivalent in Canada of the U.S. Essential Air Service Program, and nor do we have an airport improvement program for our large airports. We do have a small program for the smallest airport, but only for safety-related investments. And so there is this distinction. Now, the next few slides are going to actually go through some of the key policy and programs, and Jody will briefly comment about those.
Hi, everyone. So the first program that Mike had mentioned is the Nutrition North Canada program. So that's providing subsidies for the transportation of food goods from the south, and there's also part of the program is transporting food created in the north down to the south as well for sale. There's also the Northern Transportation Adaptation Initiative program. When I went to go look further into this program, it's now closed to apply for it, but they did have a number of grants up to $50,000 for research projects on climate change, and that was both research and implementation around technology. While we were writing our paper, the government was working on the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, and since we've written it, they've actually released that framework. It was released on the 10th of September this year. And they've created a broad and comprehensive policy guide for government policy towards the north. Obviously, investment in infrastructure projects was one of the goals that was included. And that includes the recent investments in airports and then the Churchill rail line that Mike had mentioned as well. They also are looking at expanding multimodal infrastructure as well. And then health resiliency, tying back to the Nutrition North program, is important to them. There we go. So Mike had also mentioned the ACAP program, which is our Airports Capital Assistance Program. It's a little bit different than the programs that are available in the States. It's only for safety-related investments. It's only accessible to our smaller airports. None of our large airports have access to this. And The Deputy Minister also mentioned the National Trade Corridor funding, and specific to the north, there's about $400 million that was made available for transportation infrastructure. It's a larger pool that's available to the rest of Canada as well. There's some ad hoc funding that happens through the federal government. For example, there was a P3 project that went through towards the new terminal and infrastructure at the airport in Nunavut. And then there's also territorial government funding that's passed around between Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, and we listed some of the amounts that were there in the last year that was available. So the key here is that funding is there, but it's just not quite always there. The current programs generally have fixed budgets, and they're highly competitive. There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be invested in the north, and it's similar across all the territories. One example we found was Nunavut had submitted 6 proposals for the NTCF funding, but only one of those was able to get through and be approved. So there's a bit of a lack of certainty with the available funding models that we have currently, and that's a challenge in the north.
Thanks, Jody. Just a few final comments here. If we list the challenges, there are remote regions, for example, Greece, that have islands that are remote and face remote challenges. Our remote challenges also include adverse weather. That in turn drives high construction costs. Remoteness always drives high construction costs, but remoteness with adverse weather can be very expensive. In building infrastructure to survive the harsh weather conditions is very expensive. There's high operating costs, very high cost of living in the north. There's susceptibility to disasters. As the Deputy Minister indicated, this rail line to Churchill on Hudson's Bay, it can only be described as having been a disaster for that community. It's changed the population of the community. They lost industries permanently. And there's a lot of concerns about future risk of environmental accidents. A lot of uncertainty, which is one of the reasons why they had the small funding program for research, but a lot of uncertainty about what climate change is actually going to mean in the north. One of the interesting findings has been that climate change impacts are about 3 times larger in terms of temperature changes in Canada's Arctic, and I suspect that that's the case in other northern regions, for example, in Scandinavia. And so the climate change is going to be far more dramatic impacts in the north. I've already indicated that there's limitation on aircraft choices. Now, really interesting problem are pilot and mechanic shortages. Not every pilot kind of wants to go work where the temperature is 60 degrees below zero in the winter. Doesn't matter whether it's Fahrenheit or Celsius, it's just cold. And so one of the things that the territories and the federal government and the private sector have been trying to do is institute expanded pilot training and mechanic training programs in the north. The challenge has been is they've been training people into these areas, and they want to train northern residents, people from First Nations communities in particular who grew up in the north and are more likely to tolerate and even like those conditions. The pilot shortage and mechanic shortage in the south, not just in Canada but elsewhere, China, the United States, they're all coming, and they're taking the newly trained pilots away. And the sad case right now is that they're now recruiting the instructors. So we have some programs that are not actually to continue their training because the instructors are now recruited away there. And of course, there's a lack of economic diversity in the region. This is my last slide. Some potential future policy elements. We kind of phrased these as recommendations, but that was a little bit arrogant. But we are observation is the future policy needs to recognize the vital importance of connectivity and accessibility. That's a really good paradigm. I like that, to the north. Policy needs to recognize the economic challenges of northern transport, which in Canada's case also includes the weather challenges, which means enhancing airport, road, rail, and marine infrastructure. Canada has chosen not to subsidize services, whether air service or rail or trucking services, but instead to deal with the challenges of the North through subsidy for the provision of infrastructure. The idea is to let the market decide which services are valued and can be economically provided. And this is unlike the Essential Air Service program in the U.S. or the CSO program in Europe. That's community service obligation, I think, is what that means. So it means by which certain services can be subsidized. In Canada, where support is needed, focus on the infrastructure and its high northern capital and operating costs, not on the actual operation of carriers. Continue the user pay policy in general, but with the exception of providing support for infrastructure. And then continue air programs for transport to support health resiliency, which is one of the key things in the Nutrition North program. This leads to the end of the presentation, but I actually did not have, at the time we wrote this, Lucy's excellent Table 1 of the taxonomy of support measures for remote air transport connectivity. And I've actually made some notes about how Canada fits in on that, but I won't extend my remarks right now. I can comment on that later or in the next draft of the paper. So thank you for your interest.